writing.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. All right, welcome everyone. Just opening up the library. Better make sure it's open in the next few weeks because we might want to return books or even borrow them. We've only got what, 4 more weeks, I think.
I have
Five.
I did it to return.
Sure. Yeah, you've got a list of them, so you can return. But I just got a few things out to talk about because I've mentioned some of these things in class and some of them I haven't. We're going to talk a bit about culture in a minute, but just language things. Style manual. Remember I mentioned the style manual? So this thing's old. A saying, as old as the hills. This is really old, like 1978, oh my god. So, you know, a few rules might have changed. But for example, like you want to know how to write numbers, dates, or currency. You know, like when do you write numbers as words, like 7, S-E-V-E-N, and when do you write 7? You know, those sorts of rules. Like for example, when you start a sentence, the rule is you always write it as a word. You never have a number. One of the reasons is you have a dot, obviously, the full stop just before, and if you had 7, somebody might look at it and think, oh, that's 0.7. Yeah. So there are reasons behind it, but etc., etc. So how do you abbreviate, quotations, punctuation, or when do you use italics, when do you use capitals, you know, all that sort of stuff. This is for authors, editors, and printers and publishers. So that's, you know, as I say, it's old, but you will pick up copies in the Oxfam bookshop for like $2. You probably get a more recent one. I think I've mentioned before, really, you know, all government documents are written to the Australian style manual. Your Harvard referencing is part of the style manual. Probably wouldn't be in this one, it's too old. But style manuals are good to have. It should be available on the internet, you know, out there free. They sell it for about $60, which I think is crazy. Like national productivity, you want everything at the same standard. You should make it free and available to, you know, people. But anyway, it's just be aware of, you know, those little things when you find yourself in professional work and you want to write to a certain standard, style manual. You could always ask employer or organisation to buy a copy. The other place where you can get them, much more up to date, probably, I haven't checked, but the library might have one. So if you've just got one of those little fussy kind of questions about, you know, how do I abbreviate this or whatever. Now, you know, you get lots of other books, and I've got them here on, you know, how to write and da-da-da, and they've all got, probably if you look in essays and assignments, there are probably, you know, guides to punctuation there, for example. But are they the same as that? Are they the national standard? Not necessarily. That might be an English or an American book, you know. So if you want to know what actually happens here, then the Australian style manual is the one to go for. So just a point about that. I'm just going to keep on plugging. Plug is the slang. When you plug something, you advertise it. You want to keep on plugging the Dinkum Dictionary. You should all have a copy of that under your pillow.
The latest, everybody uses Oxford Dictionary instead of Dinkum.
But Oxford, it's a totally different dictionary. Oxford is like for formal English, British English. This is Australian slang. That's the point. Really, you need a number of dictionaries. You know, as I think I've hopefully described through the course, different dictionaries have different functions and different strengths and weaknesses. I mean, this is totally weak in terms of academic language. You just wouldn't go there, would you? But it's incredibly strong in your local spoken vocabulary. So one dictionary is not going to do it. You're just not going to get it. Electronic or hard copy, nothing's got everything. And, who will be? Oh, Dilhani, thank you. Dilly. She's Australianised her name, but she's shortened to put an E on the end. Dilly, I like that. Yeah, so look, grab yourself a copy somewhere. As I say, Oxfam Bookshop is where you get the cheapo version. And yeah, I reckon half the time they have a Dinkum Dictionary somewhere there. or the big green Macquarie, which I don't have here. It's downstairs at the moment. But yeah. Don Watson. Remember I mentioned Don Watson and the decay of language. You know, the weasel words. That's the book. So I have that in my reference shelf. So if anyone wants to borrow that, it's called The Decay of Public Language. So if you're interested in that whole idea of weasel words, that's available if you like to have a look at it. And a bit of stuff, thanks. Yeah, on culture, good. I just want to do a little bit of stuff on culture now, and a few books on that. I have mentioned Hugh McKay before, the psychologist who does interviews. This is a little bit old, 90s, you know, but he interviews thousands of people as a psychologist and does what we call qualitative research. So if you think about lesbian study, that's quantitative, isn't it? Getting figures and finding out, you know, what's the average level of anxiety, say, of a 17-year-old, and comparing it. Well, that's quantitative. Qualitative is where you don't so much gather figures, you do usually in-depth, often interviews with people and finding out how they think, observation, it can be, yeah. So, and out of that, you kind of draw trends and conclusions. And he is a qualitative social psychologist, and lots of interviews with people about what sort of topics in Australia. This is social attitudes. So you got all this there. Women and men, work, managing money. We all knew Australians, I imagine that's about migration. Finding our bearings, like where am I in my life? Back to the tribe, so how do you get a sense of belonging? Do Australians have a sense of belonging? Yeah, so he's exploring that sort of stuff. Things would have changed a little bit, but not hugely. It's like any culture, you know, it shifts. But if you wanted to get a kind of an idea of, you know, inside the mind of the average Australian, that would be a useful book to read, how Australians think. There are updates. I can't remember what his latest. He's got a few, and he's gone away from this a little bit, and he's writing more about. He's got a good book called The 10 Desires That Drive Us. That's not so much about Australia, but about what motivates people. And he's got a book here on what makes them listener. So he's writing a bit differently. He hasn't done a. I think he's got an update in the early 2000s, but nothing later. But again, you'll find his stuff in Oxford. That's available to borrow if you'd like to try to speed up your transition to Australia. That would be, I'd recommend that very strongly to get a sense of the psychology of people. And I've mentioned this one before, Manning Clark. He's one of the famous historians in Australia, not around anymore. A Short History of Australia. That's the short version, yes, because it's actually a 3-volume set, much bigger. That's the short, easy version to read. I think that's just a central text for everybody if you want to understand Australia, where it's come from. It's oldish now, I think it's in the 70s, but still a good 69, yeah. But really good in terms of a broad view of Australia, where it's at, and quite readable. There, I don't know if somebody's borrowed it or can't see it there at the moment. There's a larger version that you can get with pictures in it and photographs. And the other one, I must bring it in, I saw it in the study the other day. Don Watson, the guy who's all about plain English, he has written a really readable book on the history of Australia called The Story of Australia. And you open it up, it's so readable, you know, it's so easy. And lots of photos and historical pictures and stuff. I'll bring that in because that's worth putting in the library here. Don Watson, The Story of Australia. They may even have a copy in the library. That would be even probably more readable than...
Not his party?
Eh?
Not his party?
Party?
Don's party?
Not Don's party, no. Not that Don. Philip Adams. That's edited. This is more, it's called The Retreat from Tolerance. It's about the Howard period and how under the right there was movement away from multiculturalism, tolerating other societies, the whole asylum seeker thing. Pauline Hanson. You've got some important writers here. Philip Adams got a piece, David Marr, Megan Morris, Marcia Langton. She's writing on Pauline Hanson here. Marley's not here. But yeah, it's basically how Australia's got sort of tightened up and getting more intolerant and prejudiced. 2001, so early 2000s. So again, important and negative trend in Australia, probably still going on. I've talked about that one before, but I'll just plug it again. John Spear on South Australia and the economy. And he's just been appointed as Professor at Flinders, actually. But if you really want to profile this state and its economy, and that may help you navigate your job, your career, you might read it and think, God, I've got to go to Melbourne. But it might help you make important decisions. There's quite a lot of statistics, because he's an economist, and he's got, there's statistics on recycling in South Australia. An interesting statistic, don't know if it's in here, I heard it again the other day. I think we've got 39% of our energy is renewable. We're the highest of any state. So there's quite a base for renewable energy. So people who are engineers, it might mean, I decided to specialise in that area because the state's strong or whatever. But yeah, this will give you, I think he's put out an update. He's put out this is 2009, and I reckon he's done an update in the last 3 years or 4 years. So keep your eye on him anyway, John Spear. If you want that, up-to-date profile of where you're living. Reinventing Australia. Yeah. Look, I was talking about Deep Creek yesterday. I just saw this book. Yeah, it has kind of a cute little book. If you like travel in Australia, bushwalking, how to light a fire without matches. Yes, you'll survive. How to find your way when you're lost. This is a good one. Living off the land, bush tucker. There you go. There's famous. That thing you can eat. You seen them? Witchetty grub. Witchetty grub. Aboriginal food.
I think
it's a large.
people eat that
It's
one too.
white, quite large, about like
Very
thumb.
protein, yeah.
Very full of protein.
Yeah, they
So yeah,
they
you
say
just
very
pull them out of the
it's
tree.
yeah.
They sort of live under the bark. Yeah. So if you study and you can't get a job, then what you do is you read this book and you go and live in the bush, and you'll survive. So that's plan B. That's plan B if you don't get your career sorted out. Yeah? But actually, an ex-student I saw yesterday, he dropped in at my place. He's a German guy. He was an interesting guy, he still is, of course. Historian, German. He went and got work with the Aboriginal, with the linguistics department at Adelaide Uni, because I introduced him to the linguist there, because he was interested in Aboriginal language and the recovery of Aboriginal language. So he's been working with him, and now over the years he's got connected with Aboriginal communities. I was just thinking that because he came and borrowed the swag, I've got a swag, which is like a canvas sort of bag and mattress, and he's driving today up to Hermansburg. So he has to go to Alice Springs, driving on his own, then turn left and drive for about 300 kilometres out into the desert, Hermansburg. He's out there for 2 weeks with the Aboriginal. There's an Aboriginal women's choir that are having a whole performance. And he went with them earlier this year to Germany. Because there are quite strong links, because the Lutherans, who are a German church, were in a lot of Aboriginal missions around Australia. And he is this fellow Gerhard, quite connected with the Lutheran church. And the Lutherans have a history of recording Aboriginal languages here. And he's taken groups back to Germany and back into the historical archives, and they found even like Ghana Aboriginal words recorded. The only place are in historical documents in Germany. So he's been doing a lot of this interesting work with Aboriginal communities. But it's an interesting example of how a student from here, through a connection, through voluntary work basically, out of chasing his own interests, got connected with the uni, ended up with paid work in a really interesting area. And now he's out in the Australian landscape with the swag, camping under the stars, and so that sort of volunteering can take you places, interesting places. And speaking of volunteering, that little book is not a bad one. I've spoken about how you need to get connected, like that example, Gerhard, connecting up with Aboriginal groups and recovery of language. This one is just a collection. It's a little bit old, a couple of years, but it's still sufficiently up to date. There are many organisations mentioned in here. For example, the Bicycle Institute of South Australia, and there's quite a big public discussion about the Frome Street Bikeway in particular, where they've cut out a lane and they've made it just for bicycles, and there's a big debate, should they extend it down to North Terrace or not, and the Bicycle Institute is part of a lobby group promoting it and looking at plans and discussing with urban designers. But that's a volunteer organisation. All of these organisations are looking for volunteers. Even Economic Reform Australia, how would you create a more equitable society? If you're interested in economics, echidna care. If you love cuddling echidnas, I wouldn't cuddle one. They're a bit prickly, aren't they? But
iron.
You probably would, wouldn't you, with gloves? But probably rescuing echidnas from maybe feral cats, or just helping look after them, helping preserve them. Conservation volunteers, urban ecology, vegetarian action, Save Our Gulf. That's an interesting one. Save Our Gulf, the desalination plant that extracts the salt from the water and then puts the salt back in. That's quite a problem because that concentrated salt then destroys the seagrass and all that sort of thing. So a community group set up to monitor the health of the environment there, and they were trying to stop it, but it didn't succeed. But I think they're still monitoring the health of the ecosystem down that way. Herpetology, snakes. If you're interested in snakes, you can join the Herpetologist Society, and so on. Friends of the Earth, I'm sure Land Care's in there. Conservation volunteers, a whole lot of different groups. Animal liberation, animal rights, preventing cruelty to animals, etc. If you are interested in this kind of thing, then there are the little descriptions of the organisation and contact numbers and so on. Some of them might have moved because it's probably 3 or 4 years old, but good to connect with one of those groups. Don's Party, we're going to do a little bit on Don's Party today, but that's the play script, and I'll copy a kind of random page in the next few lessons, and we'll look in detail at some of the speech, and we'll look at ways of how to approach learning slang through that. That's an interesting one. You know the word bogan? Bogan means like an uneducated, rough kind of person. It's just looking at,
Isn't he like a simple person? Someone because a friend of mine described it to me. It's like someone who's like stressed, whatever, doesn't have a care in the world. So pretty much like free spirit or something like that.
Well, not really. It's more, it's a negative term. It's a bit prejudicial too, Some people would argue that it's kind of, we don't have racist, it's not racist, but it's classist, It's like looking down on the lower class, the word itself. But it describes that subculture. And so, in a kind of humorous sort of way.
A friend of mine, he looks at it in a positive way. He doesn't look at it in a negative way.
Right.
So I asked him, like, does it mean like this, that, and that? It doesn't.
Generally, it means uneducated, low class. It's connected with, generally connected with conservative prejudices like racism. Think of Reclaim Australia, those people. Most people say, boganism. Yeah. I don't think it means, some people say, it's a negative about the working class. Most working class people are not bogan, but there is a section of the working class that is. And they generally have those fairly negative kind of prejudices, and like the word redneck, redneck, bigoted, conservative. Anyway, those are some books for today. There are all those other books in there. Feel free to borrow, over the next, we've got a few weeks left, or return. Okay. But what I'm just trying to move on to in our last few weeks is, I have mentioned this a few times and I haven't actually copied it off for you, but I've got it here now. So this stuff on culture, we've talked a bit about the cultural project as kind of just as important, or potentially more important than language. So I have a sentence. A little bit, that's it. So look, I've just called this thing cultural acceleration, meaning, how do you accelerate your transition to Australian culture? We can't cover this in one session. I'll just cover the broad titles. Just over the last couple of years, I suppose, I made this 2 or 3 years ago. I've just been adding to it as something comes up. Things that I reckon are kind of core and central to getting an understanding of Australian culture. You've got reading there, general, so some of it's general English or Western culture. That's all general, not Australian. Look, number one at the top there, not for any reason it's number one, but the Bible, because not for religious reasons, but for cultural reasons. So many stories, so many phrases come out of that. If you've got that kind of under control, you'll get a whole lot of references that people make. If someone says, "Oh, g'day, Lazarus," somebody's been sick for a long time. "Oh, look, it's Lazarus." Jesus brings Lazarus back from the dead. So it's like, "Oh, you come back from the dead." So just little things like that. Or even more serious, literature. So much Western literature uses the Bible as a basis and makes direct or indirect reference. So many paintings, So just as a cultural thing, it's useful. There are obviously levels of difficulty. The very beautiful one, version of the Bible, the King James, 1611, it's the same time as Shakespeare, and so it's beautiful poetry in it. But it can be hard to read, even for natives, and you can get much more plain English versions, or you even get a kid's version of the same stories. That's probably the easiest with pictures and so on. There's a million of them in Oxfam. So that's one way to work through something like that. Tales from Shakespeare, again, that's pretty central. A lot of people make reference to that. I have mentioned fairy stories before. Kids, probably less now because there's so much TV and internet and so on, but classically, certainly I was brought up, I've brought my kids up, and I think generally professional middle class still to a fair degree, bring kids up on the classics. So there's this core shared culture. It is shrinking though, definitely. But things like, the Brothers Grimm, they're the German fairy stories that went into English. Hans Christian Andersen, Danish. Charles Perrault, French. Those, even though they're German, Danish and French, we inherited the stories through translation back in the 19th century, or even earlier in some cases, and they've been part of the sort of average person's childhood. Little Red Riding Hood, Big Bad Wolf, Cinderella, Snow White, all those stories. Good to know them. Aesop's Fables, very old, 2,000 years or more. Aesop, the Greek guy who invented a whole lot of stories like The Fox and the Grapes. He tries and tries to get the grapes, and then he walks away and says, "Oh, look, they were sour anyway." And so people say, "Oh, you've got a case of the sour grapes." You couldn't get what you wanted, so you're just saying it's bad. Everybody else loves it, but you couldn't get it, so you dismiss it. So again, a lot of these things have gone into the language. The nursery rhymes I've mentioned, really good to read them out to get rhythm, but also just know there's little stories in them. For example, you take your kids to the, must be coming up soon, the pageant, or has it? Yeah, the Christmas pageant Wednesday. Must be very soon, it's November, isn't it? Next Saturday, okay, there you go, just in time. Yeah, so next Saturday, they start in South Terrace, go down King William Street, go around to Myers, is it? Where they end up. But I'd say at least half of those, what they call the floats, the vehicles.
When is that Christmas pageant?
Next Saturday, Hannah, is it? Yeah, and
My
it
sister
starts about 9 o'clock or whatever.
21st of November or?
14th of November.
14th, is it? Okay. It's, what time does it start? It's about 9:30, okay. Yeah, so if you get yourself, if you just search it on the net, they'll show you the route and get there kind of early because it gets pretty crowded. But good little cultural exercise. Watch the floats going past and sort of trying to figure out, what's the reference to the story, and look at the characters on the floats, and all that's good. Kind of, if you worked your way through something like that, you get all those references, or a lot of them. The House at Pooh Corner, now we are 6. These are kids' stories about Winnie the Pooh. Remember that story? Did we look at that? No, we didn't. They're nice little English stories. Wind in the Willows, English story about... So, House at Pooh Corner, Christopher Robin and the bear. Pooh, bear. Yeah, now we are 6. Good, very rhythmic poetry, written by the same guy. Wind in the Willows, you've got... It's the English countryside. You've got a rat and a mole and Mr. Toad, these 3 characters. Beautifully written, fantastic language. We should, if we get time, even look at the first paragraph, the opening, and it's so rich and beautiful description of springtime. Just linguistically, really, really fantastically written. These are, made into cartoons and millions of films and so on. Wizard of Oz, I think you might know, Dorothy and the Yellow Brick Road. Even something like I've mentioned before, Sydney is called the Emerald City. I think I've mentioned that, and that comes from Wizard of Oz, because Oz, Australia, slang. And then, okay, what's the glittering city in Oz? Well, it's Sydney. So therefore, yeah, the Emerald City. So little reference like that. Politically, George Orwell, incredibly important. Animal Farm, the story of the animals that take over the farm. It's like a revolution. It's actually what we call an allegory, a symbolic parallel to the Russian Revolution and how the Russian Revolution got corrupted. So, and 1984, a totalitarian society, which means a party that is only one party and it's in total control, and it's watching everybody with cameras, and it controls the media and controls even the language totally. These very important books shape our thinking and our language about politics and social issues. There's even a word, Orwellian. Oh, that's very Orwellian, named after Orwell. If any of those tricks are tried by a group or a political, government or whatever, they say, oh, that's very Orwellian. Dickens, yeah, Oliver Twist. Dickens is pretty important. Sophie's World, if you want philosophy and a history of mainly Western philosophy up to the present, the main dominant ideas of the West, absolutely Sophie's World. That was written kind of for early teenage readers. It's told as a story. This girl, Sophie, starts getting these letters from this unknown person. And there's this kind of mystery in the book, so it's a fictional thing, but each letter is about a different stage of philosophy, and things described quite easily for generally sort of teenage level readers. And it's, if you want a quick journey through they're fantastic for critical thinking in terms of getting basic paradigms and models of thinking, and where mainly the West has been with those ideas. But that's a really good summary. So those sorts of things are things, as I say, that are kind of fairly foundational or will give you a quick familiarity with. I won't go through the others today. We'll maybe just do, it's too much information, but it's better if we kind of go slow and we maybe do one a day or something.